All right, so you're here with us because you really want to, like, get down into philosophy.
You want to understand it.
Yeah, you want to understand it. And specifically, you want to understand complex thinkers.
Yeah.
But without, like, feeling overwhelmed, you know?
Not drowning in the details.
Not drowning, right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we want to do here.
Exactly.
And so today we're going on a deep dive into the moral and political philosophy of Samuel Pufendorf.
Pufendorf, that's right.
Big name, 17th century, but maybe not a name, like right off the bat. And to guide us, we're going to be using excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So Pufendorf, he lived in a Europe that was still kind of reeling from religious wars.
Yeah, still dealing with the fallout.
Yeah. The Peace of Westphalia had just like redrawn the map of the Holy Roman Empire.
It's like the New World.
Totally. So you've got like Austria, Bavaria, Saxony, Brandenburg, all these like power players.
All jostling for position.
Right. And then you have external pressures too,
Absolutely. You've got France on one side, Ottomans on the other.
Right. Huge. So everyone's trying to like avoid falling back into those conflicts.
Yeah. Keeping the peace was paramount.
Yeah. Fragile peace.
Very fragile.
So Pufendorf's project really comes out of this context.
Oh, absolutely. His whole aim was to like find a way to stop society from just imploding, falling into this chaos. He called it the state of nature.
Yeah. And the thing is, he goes about it in a really secular way.
Really secular. Very deliberate about that.
Yeah.
Not basing it on religious dogma.
Like, not at all.
Not at all. Not on the scholastic traditions,
right.
All those metaphysical speculations that were all the rage in Germany at the time.
Mm-hmm. Catholics and Protestants.
Both sides, yeah.
So a real break.
A real break. So who's he reading? Who are his influences?
Yeah. Who's shaping his thinking?
Well, he's got Bodin.
Okay.
With the sovereignty stuff.
Sorry.
Lipsius, the neo-Stoic.
Okay. So we're talking about like...
We're talking big names.
Big thinkers.
Yeah. And then there's Grotius with the law.
Okay. Legal philosophy?
And, of course, Hobbes.
Right, of course.
The guy with the bleak view of, like, everything.
State of nature, yeah.
But he's also looking at the Italians.
Okay.
The reason of state tradition. Real politic,
Okay.
So it's a real mix. It puts him in this unique spot. Like, in ethics, he's a voluntarist.
Okay.
Meaning he thinks God's will is where moral obligations come from, not some inherent truth.
Okay.
Politically, he's all about sovereignty.
Okay.
The nature of state power, the limits. And internationally, he's a realist. It's all about power dynamics between nations.
Okay. So his natural law theory.
Yeah.
How does that fit in?
It's what they call modern or Protestant natural law, different from the more metaphysical guys.
Okay, so like Suarez,
Vittoria, or even the super rationalists like Leibniz and Wolff.
Okay.
So not just an academic in an ivory tower.
No.
Definitely not. Pufendorf was a scholar, a jurist, a historian. His writings, all over the place. Church and state, religious toleration.
He even got into Baconian innovation in philosophy.
Right, and his work was super popular.
Hugely popular,
Okay.
Clear, comprehensive. People loved it. Translated to tons of languages.
Okay.
They were like the standard textbooks in universities, like all through the 18th century.
Wow.
Yeah. So think about it. His ideas literally shaped how people talked about morality, society, politics, international relations, the whole shebang.
Huge. So let's get into how he got there, his life.
Yeah, let's talk about his journey.
So it sounds like his career wasn't always easy.
Not a walk in the park, no.
No.
But he got a solid education early on, showed real talent for languages, classics, all that at the Fürstenschule at Grimme, that early training in philology, super valuable later on.
Right, makes sense.
With all the textual analysis and stuff.
So when he gets the professorship at Lund.
At Lund University in Sweden.
Right.
That was a big moment.
Yeah.
He was set. Teaching natural law, law of nations, ethics, politics.
Okay.
He quickly got a following. Yeah. But then the trouble starts.
Yeah. That's when things get a bit dicey.
Yeah.
His big book on the law of nature and of nations, we call it DJN.
DJN, okay.
It caused quite a stir.
Like what kind of stir?
Well, some of his colleagues, the jurist Beckman and the theologian Schwartz, they accused him of heresy.
Whoa. In this climate.
In that climate. Huge deal.
Yeah.
They even put together this list of his supposed errors.
Like a
called it an index of certain novelties.
Okay, so like a hit list.
Basically, it could have ended his career.
Totally.
Maybe worse.
So how does he get out of that?
Connections.
Okay.
He was close with the Swedish court.
Okay.
Managed to suppress the index.
Huh.
Defended himself in Lund. It worked. Beckmann ended up getting kicked out.
Wow.
But the opposition didn't just vanish.
Right.
His writings, banned in Saxony, led to this whole feud with the bigwigs in the Saxon universities.
Yeah. So I guess this period...
It's what he called the Scandinavian Quarrel.
Okay. But it's important.
In what way?
He had to really clarify his ideas.
Okay.
About natural law. And it shows this bigger split. Between the secular natural law crowd and the old school Lutheran scholastics.
So it's
a real turning point.
Yeah.
So despite all this drama, Pufendorf kept writing.
Right.
He did a shorter, super influential version of DJN.
This is on the duty of man and citizen according to natural law.
That's one. We call it DO.
DO, okay.
It was a hit.
Really?
For a century. It was the go-to text in universities.
Wow.
And then he also published collections of his dissertations.
Okay.
Showing off all his interests.
Yeah.
And get this.
Yeah.
He wrote a whole political thing defending Sweden's part in the Dutch War.
So
putting his theories into practice.
Putting it into practice.
Wow.
So then he moves to Stockholm.
Becomes the royal historiographer.
Okay.
And eventually a privy councillor.
So an advisor.
Advisor to the king.
Wow. Most of his historical writing focused on Sweden's foreign policy.
Okay.
But he also wrote Anecdotes of Sweden.
What's that about?
It gives you a peek into Swedish politics behind the scenes.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you see how he's doing all this theoretical work, but he's also right there in the thick of things with the politics and diplomacy. It's all connected.
Yeah.
So let's get back to his method of modern natural law.
Right. You were saying what made it different.
Right. What set it apart.
So modern natural law, Pufendorf and his crew, they made it secular on purpose. It's often called Protestant natural law. But the idea was that anyone could get it through reason.
Okay.
Pufendorf himself actually helped create this whole narrative
about
his intellectual shift in his book, Sample of Controversies.
Okay.
He knew that some of these ideas were in older traditions, like Stoicism, Roman law, scholastic thought.
Okay.
But he and his buddies, they were pushing for a Baconian novelty. What's that? What was so new?
The big thing was they didn't want to base everything on metaphysics and theology. They wanted morality and law grounded in reason and experience.
So not revelation.
Not divine revelation, no abstract systems. They rejected appeals to authority and went for an eclectic approach.
So what does that mean?
It means picking and choosing from different traditions, synthesizing different views, and then building new knowledge on solid ground.
Okay, so
almost a scientific footing.
Yeah. So who does he see as the originator of this?
He credits Hugo Grotius.
Grotius, okay.
He saw him as the founder of this noble discipline.
Okay.
Grotius was trying to build a system that didn't rely on old authorities and one that could settle arguments using reason.
Right.
Samuel von Koschigi later said Grotius freed natural law from theology.
Okay.
And then there's Barbeyrac,
Word-rack.
Pufendorf's French translator.
Right.
He famously said that Bacon and Grotius had revived the science of morality.
And that Pufendorf had then improved it, made it better, systematized it.
Okay. But I imagine not everyone agreed with this whole
story. No way.
Yeah.
Some scholars, they question this idea that Grotius and Hobbes were completely secular.
Right.
They point out the theological and metaphysical stuff that's still there.
Yeah.
Plus, this narrative ignores Pufendorf's own context.
In Germany. Ever.
The Holy Roman Empire, all those political and religious complexities. And the intellectual climate in northern Germany was still very metaphysical.
Okay.
Theological, Lutheran, guys like Johannes Karpsov, Christian Thomasius.
Okay.
Earlier on, they were more conservative.
Okay.
More into scholasticism. And Pufendorf and the younger Thomasius.
Okay.
They argued with them a lot. It wasn't just some abstract academic debate.
Right, and real stakes.
Real stakes. It was about the direction of German intellectual life.
Wow.
And this tension continued right up to Kant.
These guys, they were more for a theocracy guided by scripture, supernatural metaphysics. Pufendorf and later Thomasius. They wanted a secular state.
Right, so totally different worldviews.
Totally different. So how does Pufendorf's own method develop?
Yeah, how does he respond to all this?
So early on, he's influenced by Erhard Weigel.
Okay, who's that?
Mathematician, philosopher, trying to create these big systems of knowledge.
Right.
So Pufendorf, in his first book, Elements of Universal Jurisprudence, he tries a mathematical approach.
Yep.
He wants that same certainty in morals that you get in geometry. So the book is structured with definitions and principles, and then axioms and observations. He thought the axioms were self-evident to reason. And the observations were based on experience and common sense.
So
it's all about being systematic and rigorous.
Right. But he doesn't stick with that.
No, he doesn't. He gets criticized by big names like Herman Conring, Johann Buchler. They tell him he needs to look at more authors. Engage with the history of legal thought.
Right.
So starting with his dissertations at Heidelberg and going through his big natural law works at Lund, he ditches the most geometricus. No more rigid deductions. He starts engaging with all these different authors. He was really learned, citing all these sources. But he wasn't just commenting. He wanted a deeper understanding, one that took into account history and experience, political events, social realities. It all fed into his arguments.
So it's still rational.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But it's
but it's more grounded.
More grounded.
Yeah. So now let's talk moral philosophy.
Yeah. And this idea of moral entities.
Moral entities, yeah.
What are those? Like, for someone coming from metaphysics.
Right. For a philosopher.
How should we understand this?
So Pufendorf, On the Law of Nature and of Nations, he starts by saying that physical science, it's done a great job studying the natural world.
Right.
But moral entities, all the concepts and categories that shape our actions and social life, they haven't gotten the same attention.
Even though they're so important.
Super important. He describes these moral entities as modes. They depend on self-subsistent entities.
So like qualities or characteristics?
Qualities, characteristics. They belong to substances, individuals or groups. And he says these moral entities are basically invented.
Like made up.
Or instituted by thinking beings, mainly humans, but ultimately God. They superadd or impose these notions onto the world and onto human actions to guide us, to create social order. But when you say invented...
Right. Doesn't that seem kind of arbitrary?
He does make a distinction between moral entities that flow naturally from things and those that are superadded by intelligent power through choices and agreements.
Right. But you have to see this in his voluntarist framework.
Right.
He believed God created the world. And with it, natural law. So that's a basic normative dimension right there. But then humans, with our reason and our interactions, we develop more specific moral distinctions and institutions.
So it starts with something inherent, but
then we build on it.
We build on it.
Yeah, with our will and our agreements.
So what are these categories of moral entities?
He has 4 main types. Kind of like Aristotle's categories for physical stuff. So first you've got states or conditions. Then substances, specifically persons in their roles. Then moral qualities. And finally, moral quantities.
Break that down a little bit more.
So states, these are like moral legal spaces or conditions. Like the natural state of humanity versus all the adventitious states we create through our actions and agreements.
Like what kind of things? Commercial relationships, marriage, citizenship, personhood, for Pufendorf, isn't just being human. It's about the roles and capacities we have individually and collectively.
In these different states.
And because these roles can clash, we need to be clear about obligations and rights.
And moral quality.
Those are the things that arise from these states and roles, obligations, rights, powers, duties. And lastly, moral quantities. That's about value and worth estimation.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. So with states, think about the natural state itself. No common authority. Then you have the civil state, where we're subject to a sovereign.
And the rule of law.
Exactly. And within that civil state, you can be a property owner or a contracting party, each with its own moral and legal baggage.
And for moral qualities, what about obligation?
So an obligation, it's this moral necessity
to do something,
to act or not act, or to endure something. And it comes from a law or a command issued by a legitimate superior. And then, I guess, It can be tricky.
How so?
Well, it can be a rightful claim to have something or receive something, but it can also mean you're allowed to act a certain way, to command others, to possess things.
Right.
It's close to power or authority. Potestas.
Okay. So he breaks down power into types?
He does. 4 types.
Definitely.
You've got freedom.
Okay.
Power over yourself. Sovereignty. Supreme power over others in a political entity.
Right.
Dominion.
Okay.
Power over your own stuff.
Okay.
And lordship. Power over other people's stuff.
Okay, so you can gain or lose these powers.
You can. And you can hold them to different degrees.
Okay, so most of DJN is about...
Most of DJN is about how all these moral entities work.
Okay.
How they come about. How they play out in different states of life.
Yeah.
It might seem abstract at first.
Right.
But it had a huge impact on how we think about morality and law.
Yeah, like...
Rights, duties, political authority.
Yeah.
It all goes back to this.
Interesting. Let's talk more about obligation.
Okay, obligation.
He says it's a moral necessity.
Right.
Like being bound to something.
Yeah, he really breaks it down.
Okay.
Especially in relation to law, sanctions, and lawgivers. It's all in Book 1, Chapter 6 of DJN.
Okay.
He's careful to distinguish law from other things.
Like?
Advice, agreements between equals, just having a right to do something.
Okay.
His point is that obligation comes from a superior.
Someone with authority.
Someone with authority.
Yeah.
And the power to back it up
right.
with sanctions. They command or prohibit things.
Okay.
And you have to comply.
So why do we have to comply?
Well, it's partly because you recognize their authority.
Oh.
You respect the law. And partly it's fear of the consequences.
Right.
The sanctions.
The sanctions.
So it's reason and pragmatism.
Yeah.
Both are needed for an obligation to really work.
Right. And this gets into the whole debate about
where moral duty comes from.
Yeah.
Is it will or is it reason?
Voluntarism versus intellectualism.
Exactly.
So where does Pufendorf land?
He leans towards voluntarism.
Okay.
Especially with divine law.
Okay.
He thinks our duties come from God's will and commands, not from some built-in rational order.
Right.
That's the intellectualist view.
Okay.
Leibniz criticized him for this.
For being a voluntarist.
Yeah. He thought morals had to be based on reason.
Okay.
But Barbeyrac defended Pufendorf. He said you need a sovereign will to actually make and enforce laws. So this question about where norms come from, it's still a big deal today.
That's a fundamental question.
Absolutely. And then there's this other distinction Pufendorf makes between natural and moral goods.
Okay, so for him...
He says natural goods.
Like health, wealth, pleasure.
Yeah, all that. They're morally indifferent.
Meaning?
They don't automatically create obligations.
Okay.
He wasn't a teleologist.
Right, like you don't have to pursue these things because they're good in themselves.
Right.
And he wasn't a consequentialist either.
Right.
Like it's not just about outcomes.
Not in that simple way.
Okay. So what role do natural goods play then?
They're the reason for imposing moral entities and obligations.
Okay.
They're the evidence. So God, primarily, but also human lawmakers.
Okay.
They look at what helps or harms people, what promotes or undermines peace and sociality.
Yeah.
That's how they decide what to command.
Okay.
So the natural consequences of actions,
right.
That's the reason for the command, and that's why people might obey, because it makes sense.
Yeah.
He uses these interesting examples like Caligula making his horse a senator.
Oh, yeah.
Or the Romans deifying emperors. His point is that if you're going to impose something, it should have a real effect on people, not just be arbitrary.
Right. So the legitimacy of commands...
Whether from God or humans, it depends on whether the commander actually benefits the people.
Okay. So even though natural good and evil aren't the source of obligation?
Not in themselves.
Right.
They explain why we have obligations and what they're for. Yep. It's all about experience. Okay. Empirical investigation, history. Right. That's how we figure out what our obligations are and why we might disagree about them.
Right.
But the basic idea is that some actions are commanded, and we can figure that out.
Within our moral and social contexts.
Yeah. Now the natural state.
The natural state. Huge in early modern political philosophy.
Absolutely crucial.
So why did Pufendorf care so much about it?
He thought you couldn't have a good political theory without understanding the natural state. He criticized anyone who ignored it, called their work defective.
Wow.
He talks about it in 5 of his books. like elements of universal jurisprudence, aris scandica.
Mm-hmm.
And even though there are differences in emphasis,
yeah,
the core idea stays the same.
Okay.
In DJN, he has two versions.
Okay, two versions of the natural state.
Yeah. One in Book 2, Chapter 2, to show why we need law and moral authority in general.
Okay.
And the other in Book 7, Chapter 1.
Okay.
Specifically to justify civil power and sovereignty.
Okay, so both are about...
Both are about legal obligation.
Right, like it's an imposition.
It's an imposition.
But a justified way.
Justified by a superior who can enforce it with sanctions.
Okay, so the natural state is like the starting point.
It's the baseline.
To show why we need government.
Exactly. He says civil sovereignty is necessary.
Okay.
Because when we move beyond the natural state, we create new problems. Okay. We develop language, complex social interactions.
Right.
Property. Yeah. And that leads to more conflict.
As things get more complex.
Exactly. And he applies this to international relations, too.
Totally.
He says states are in a kind of international state of nature.
Right.
No world government.
Yeah.
So same problems.
Same problems.
Yeah. Which is why we need international law.
Right. So his whole system...
Morality, politics, international law. It's all based on this idea of the natural state.
Yeah. Okay, so what's in the natural state?
Well, he has three ways of understanding it.
3 ways, okay.
They overlapped.
Okay.
First, there's the natural state toward God.
Adam.
It's about what makes humans different from animals.
Okay.
We have potential.
Mm-hmm.
We can be moral.
Okay.
Animals can't.
Right.
And then there's the state against God.
Okay.
Where we lack moral awareness.
Mm-hmm.
We become moralized through social interaction.
So we move beyond that primitive state.
Exactly. Second, there's the natural state in regard to oneself.
In se.
This is about how helpless we are alone. Without help from others, we'd be like beasts and eat each other. And third, there's the natural state toward other humans.
At alios homines.
This is where the potential for conflict comes in.
Okay.
Because there's no higher power to enforce the rules.
So this is the pre-civil state.
The pre-civil state.
Right.
No civil law.
Right. But he's not saying we should go back to this.
No, not at all. These are not ideals.
Okay.
Morality comes from moving beyond these conditions.
Right. And he makes further distinctions.
He does. He talks about full or perfect versions of the natural state.
Okay.
Which are totally hypothetical, like no cooperation at all.
Right.
And then partial or limited versions, which are more realistic. Like rival families or Robinson Crusoe.
Right.
The extreme versions are just to illustrate the point.
Of why we need society and government.
Exactly. He also looks at what Grotius, Hobbes, and Spinoza said about the natural state. He agrees and disagrees with them.
So what's his final take?
His conclusion is kind of paradoxical.
Okay.
He says humans never were... aren't now, and never will be in a pure natural state.
Okay.
Because it would be horrible.
Right.
He agrees with Hobbes on that. But unlike Hobbes, he says the natural state is actually peaceful.
Peaceful?
Yeah. But it's a fragile peace.